Open your Bibles with me this morning to Hebrews chapter 9 to begin with. And we're going to continue on with the message series that I started a couple weeks ago called Good for What Ails You. Good for What Ails You. You know, you remember the old Western movies? They used to have the medicine man or the guy'd come to town with his wagon, you know, and have some picture of some bottle of some syrup on the side of it and say, good for what ails you. I don't know. I'm old. That's stuck in my mind, you know. So that's why I decided to go with that. Hebrews chapter 9. And again, I'm just going to go through 4 quick verses here to try to bring us back to the idea of what we're dealing with here. Verse 9, it was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to conscience. Everybody say conscience. And then down to verse 14, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And then, of course, the verse that we started working with, or the middle verse of Hebrews chapter 10, verse 2, for then would they not have ceased to be offered, for the worshipers, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sin. And then the 22nd verse of the 10th chapter, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. And later on, we're going to deal more with some of these passages of Scripture. But it seems as though to the writer, to the author of this book of Hebrews, that no more sin consciousness was really the central issue of the gospel in his mind, his or her mind, okay? And it's very important. Now, as we saw last week, you know, our Yahwist contributors to the creation story, beginning in about Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4, those contributors tell us, basically, that the death of humanity was solely the product of man having, I'm going to call it gained. It was not a gain, it was a loss, but having gained the knowledge of of good and evil. Isn't that right? We talked about that last week, how in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Of the tree that is, you know, in the garden, the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not surely die. And so we saw that the emphasis by the Yahwist contributors, you know, was that the death that we so often talk about, that death of humanity, was fully the product, you know, of man having gained the knowledge of good and evil. And again, I want to make sure we understand that sin consciousness is simply New Testament language for this instrument of death that is called the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis chapter 2. In the New Testament, it is called sin consciousness, but it is the same thing. It is the knowledge of good and evil, or sin consciousness. They're synonymous with one another. Now, sadly today, referring particularly to chapter 10 and verse 2, having no more consciousness of sins. Sadly today, probably our best understanding of no more consciousness of sins goes something like this. Well, because of Jesus, and because I have accepted Jesus, I no longer need to feel separated from God as a result of my transgressions. Right? Well, that's probably our best understanding. And while there is a particle of truth in that, it's a very small part. I want you to understand it's a very small part, and that very small part is really impossible to fully engage individually until we engage the bigger picture. Because you see, having no more consciousness of sins, now listen to me carefully, because this will rattle some cages, I know it will, but having no more consciousness of sins is really not a personal behavior issue at all. I let that sink in, because we have always read would have no more consciousness of sins. And of course, the word sins immediately brings to the surface all of those behavioral things that have been attributed to us as sin or evil or wrong. But this no more consciousness of sins really is not a behavioral issue at all. The revelation of no more consciousness of sins can only flow out of, now listen to me carefully, can only flow out of regarding no man according to the flesh. What does that mean? Regarding no man according to his behavior, right? His race, his political involvement, whatever. But see, that having no more consciousness of sins is not a personal behavior issue at all. Yes, there's a particle of truth in that, as I've already said, but it's a very small part of what we're dealing with. Because remember, it's the knowledge of sin and death the knowledge of good and evil that brought death to humanity, right? It was death to every relationship, death to every thought, death to every response. Isn't that right? And what we need to, and as I said, sin consciousness is simply New Testament language for Old Testament knowledge of good and evil. I want you to get that. All right, so now we saw last time, that man engaged and fell victim to a dualism in the knowledge of good and evil. He engaged and became victim to dualism. And whether you realize it or not, you will eventually. Dualism stands in opposition to the gospel. Dualism, which you have been taught so much of in the church and have grown up with so much of, is actually a contradiction to the gospel. So let me once again, too, give you the definition, and we know that it has to be a perfect definition because it comes from Google, of dualism as it pertains to theology. But I think this is really a pretty accurate. Obviously, it's simplified, and you could get you a theologian that could probably build this up and make a much bigger picture. But just as it pertains to theology, dualism is the theory that the universe has been ruled from its origin by two, get these words now, two antagonistic powers, one good, the other evil, both existing as equally ultimate first causes. Okay? To you and me, that would be God and the devil as equal powers in warfare over humanity. All right, and from that, the belief that humans, therefore, have two basic natures, the physical and the spiritual, or the secular and the sacred. This is dualism. This dualism stands in opposition to the gospel, stands in opposition to the truth of creation, see? And so we want to understand, and why am I saying this? Because this is still today, these are still common themes in the church today. The war between God and Satan, as though they were two equal and ultimate, but they're two antagonistic forces, right? And the idea that man has two basic natures, the physical and the spiritual. We talked about this in a previous series a little bit. And I won't go back over that, but the idea that man is both secular and spiritual separately. All right? But this has remained, and it continues to be the central message of much of the church, doesn't it? It's based on sin consciousness. It's a sin-conscious foundation that's been laid in the church. Or it's a knowledge of good and evil foundation that's been laid in the church and continues to be propagated week after week and day after day in the church, both from the pulpit and in your thoughts moment by moment and day by day. You know what I'm saying? It's, the way it's most recognizable, I referred to this last week, the way we most easily recognize it, but this is by no means the only way that it's spoken, but the way we hear it all the time is born in sin as a fallen man into a fallen world, separated from God, possibly even go so far as to say the very seed of Satan, right? And needing to engage in spiritual warfare in order to free yourself from, one antagonistic force and make yourself available to the other. Now, one form or another, most of us have been engaged in that kind of doctrine at some point in time. We've heard that put around. Now, as I said, two antagonistic powers. Now, the word antagonistic here is the key word in the definition of dualism, as it applies to sin consciousness. Now, again, I'm going over some things again that I talked about last week. I'm going to try to say them a little bit differently because I want you to get this. I want you to understand how important this is. Because we, not just here at FHM by any means, all of us as individuals, but the entire world, not just the church, not just those who call themselves Christian, not just but the world is what do I want to say, abiding in the knowledge of good and evil, sin consciousness. And as I've already suggested, the writer of Hebrews seems to suggest that no more consciousness of sins is really the central issue of the gospel. Is really that for which Jesus Christ really came, was to absolve the consciousness of sins. So we need to understand what this means so that we can begin to experience the benefit of it, all right? So as I said, the key word with regard to dualism is antagonistic, as it applies to sin consciousness in particular. See, dualism places a burden on humanity that we are not created to bear, not capable of bearing, even though we give it our best shot and continue to do so ignorantly. We're not equipped with dualism, because dualism places a burden on us. As I said to you last week, what that burden, I guess to simplify it, is this: dualism demands from us, designations of antagonistic classifications. It demands it. In other words, for every good, there must be an evil. It's the knowledge of good and evil in antagonistic opposition to one another is what has brought destruction to humanity. This was the warning of Papa in the garden. Not the threat of Papa in the garden. If you disobey me, you'll die, even though that was in fact a truth, a reality, but it wasn't a threat from the Father. It was a warning. Here's what will happen. The knowledge of good and evil is not something that you can manage. It's not something that you can deal with. It will destroy you. It will destroy every relationship, every part of your being. It will destroy society and culture and humanity in every aspect. See? So that's what it does. It demands from us this designation of antagonistic classifications. And so, as I said, we have these. This is what from which rises racism, sexism, nationalism. See? Now, when I say nationalism, I'm not talking about living in a country that has borders. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the way we respond. It's an us and them mentality. All of these things I'm talking about are us and them, if you will. Racism, sexism, nationalism. When we have that us and them perspective, you see, we need to understand that this has risen out of dualism. It has risen out of the necessity in our own minds, in our own hearts, to establish an evil in contradiction to a good. Because that's what dualism does all the time, all right? Now, hopefully you're able to quickly understand, that the doctrines of evangelicalism and fundamentalism that declare separation, exclusion, eternal conscious torment, these kind of things, okay, that these doctrines really, are all derived from that deadly instrument called the knowledge of good and evil. Think about that. AKA sin consciousness. All these doctrines that we're familiar with. Now, not every doctrine of evangelicalism and fundamentalism is founded on this, but you see, once you have established certain ground underneath you, everything is going to relate to that. So this is why we find grace preachers who still, while speaking of grace, tell you about being born in sin. And a fallen man in a fallen world, separated from God, needing to engage in spiritual warfare one way or the other in order to engage the God who loves you, right? Okay. Well, anyway. So here's the thing. Consequently, the good that is designated as good by good and evil is not good at all. Let that sink in. The good that is designated good in our sin-conscious surroundings, The good that is designated good by the knowledge of good and evil is not good at all, but is fully one half of the dead works that the blood of Christ is to cleanse from our conscience. See, we think dead works, and because we think the knowledge that sin consciousness has to do with being absolved of just those evil things that we've done, or not those evil things not being allowed to separate us from God, not realizing that many of those evil things are arbitrarily defined for us by somebody who just doesn't like that. I remember years ago when Marilyn and I first started having a home Bible study, when I was still working at CSU back in the in the middle 70s, a young lady that was came up to our house one day all in tears, and she had an Iranian boyfriend. They were both students at Colorado State University, and they were both very great kids. She came to our house. She had actually been confronted on College Avenue, walking right in front of where Old Main used to be. They were walking down the street holding hands, and this Christian lady that this young lady knew from the church that they attended, I guess we did at the same time, got out and basically accosted her for holding hands with a man of another race in public. Because she gave her, I don't know, gave her chapter and verse, but she let her know that that was evil. See, now to that woman, that was evil. To this young lady, that was very confusing, but she wasn't sure because she was new as a believer. See what I'm saying? So when I talk about good and evil, we need to realize that we have set up a lot of arbitrary values. We have declared, because of the knowledge of good and evil, because we are a sin-conscious people in, in rejection of the true gospel. We are a sin-conscious people. Because of that, we have established arbitrary values. And we'll talk more about that. But when I say that the good, then, is not really good at all, the good that has been discerned or decreed to be good because we operate from a knowledge of good and evil, that good is not good at all, but is actually included in, is fully one half of, at least, the dead works that Hebrews 9:14 speaks of. We only think of dead works as those things we have called evil, but they may not even be evil. There was nothing evil about what this young lady was doing, walking down the street holding hands with this young man. See? But the good works, those things that we pride ourselves in, those things that have been fed to us through some antagonistic classification and categorization system, those things are dead works. Now we got to get this. It's very important. Okay? So in other words, as I said last week, it's not good synonymous with the good of Genesis 1:31, that God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Right? That's a different good. That's not this good. This is a good that has been determined to be good by the knowledge of good and evil, or sin consciousness in humanity. Can you understand what I'm saying? There's a difference. We have labeled something good based on arbitrary eye of the beholder perspective, which makes, of course, my eye the discerning eye. It makes my eye the classifying eye, right? It makes my arbitrary thought, you see? As I said last week, many of us are suffering today under the arbitrary decisions of others, the arbitrary positions of others, maybe from as far back as Old Testament prophets who were just simply, responding to their God in a way that was deemed appropriate in those days before there was a revelation of Jesus, and yet maybe we're still caught under some of those particular implied restraints on our own lives. Does that make sense to you? This is so important that we get this. All right, so I want you to get this. The good from which we've built so much of our how to be a proper Christian, right, is in fact nothing more than the harmful excretions of sin consciousness. You like that? It's just an arbitrary, I tried to keep it clean, okay? It's an arbitrary eye of the beholder good that seeps out of listen to me, that seeps out of the assumption that we have the mind of God, that we really are qualified to make these decisions, to categorize human behaviors and so on, that our thoughts are his thoughts, and that our ways are his ways. You see, we have elevated ourselves to be as God. That's what the knowledge of good and evil, or sin consciousness, is all about. This is what the central message of the gospel is freeing man from this burden that we are incapable of carrying out. We aren't qualified. We never were. You getting it? So these are things that cripple us. They're death to our relationships. All right, so let's take a few moments today. I want to take a few moments to consider our conscience. Now, in the Disney production, Pinocchio, Jiminy Cricket receives a visitation from a beautiful blonde angel in a gorgeous blue dress. You're all familiar with that, right? All you old folks are anyway. Okay? He receives a visitation. She must be from heaven because she's a beautiful blonde in a blue dress. It's got to be, right? And what is her mission? Well, just prior to her appearing, we have a little boy who used to be wood, now he's turning to flesh. And he's saying to Jiminy, he's saying, how do I know right from wrong? Boom, here comes the angel, right? And her mission is to appoint and anoint Jiminy as Pinocchio's conscience, right? So Jiminy Cricket becomes Jiminy Conscience. All right? All right, so that's the deal. And then just before leaving, she imparts this wisdom, question mark, in my imagination, to Pinocchio. Always let your conscience be your guide. Y'all know that? Remember the song? You probably didn't hear it like that, did you? Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. No. But anyway, she imparts that wisdom. Well, here's my question, first of all. Was she truly an angel of light? And did she actually then successfully appoint Jiminy Cricket to be as a true prophet of God to Pinocchio? Or was she, as Elvis would say, the devil in disguise? See? Because we know that the messengers of Satan disguise themselves as angels of light, right? Was she the devil in disguise? And was she actually setting poor, unsuspecting Jiminy up to be an antichrist figure, or at best, an influential evangelical? Well, let's see if this was a messenger from God or a messenger from Satan, and let's see what role Jiminy actually accepted and fell into and got excited about. All right? All right. Go with me to Romans chapter 2 and verse 15. And I'm going to shorten some of these verses, and it won't change anything about what we're dealing with today. So later on, I'll probably go back and pick up some more of the context of these passages. But verse 15, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience. Now, of course, this is the part I want to focus in on. Now, I'm reading, first of all, out of the New King James Bible, but in just a moment, we're going to completely set aside a portion of this until the end today, and we're going to fill in with some better versions, some things that actually say it in a clearer way. All right, so he said here, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to set aside and between themselves their thoughts for just a moment. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to fill that in with several other versions, three of them that say that agree with one another, and two others that say the same thing but use a different word. And we're going to fill it in so that you get a better idea of what's actually being said here, all right? Their conscience also bearing witness and, okay, now, New English Translation, Revised Standard Version, English Standard Version says this: their conscience also bearing witness and their conflicting thoughts, accusing or else excusing them. The Holman Version says this: their conscience also bearing witness and their competing thoughts, accusing or else excusing them. And then, of course, some of you have the New American Standard Bible, and it says their thoughts alternately accusing or else excusing them. Now, of course, this is what I want you first to notice. Now, you would not necessarily have seen that right directly from the New King James and the way it's translated there, but it does make sense, and we'll get to it at the end. But anyway, so here's what I want you to note, of course. I want you to notice conflicting, competing, alternating thoughts. Because what is that doing? That is emphasizing inconsistency, instability, indecisiveness, right? Conflicting thoughts. Yeah, double-mindedness. Isn't that right? Now, what I'm going to do for the next couple of minutes is I'm going to jerk a phrase here and there out of a few little unsuspecting verses. They don't know I'm going to do this to them. Okay? I'm going to just jerk a phrase here and there just to illuminate this point. Now, I don't recommend this as a practice for creating sound doctrine, just jerking a phrase here and there, right? However, it will serve my purpose, and so we're doing it anyway. No, really, I'm going to make a point with this, separate from the context of these scriptures. If you'll slide over to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And actually, we're going to look at 3 verses in this one chapter, all in the same context, basically. Verse 7, however, there is not in everyone that knowledge, for some with consciousness of the idol, until now, eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. And then down to verse 10, for if anyone sees you, who have knowledge, eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And then verse 12, but when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Now again, we're not going to deal with the context of this right now, but here's what I want you to see. In verse 7, it says, their conscience being weak and defiled. Right? And then in verse 10, it says, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat that which has been offered, okay? But now I want you to go to verse 12 again, all right? You sin against the brethren. I want you to make sure you grab this. The brethren, and wound their weak conscience. So in other words, what I've read to you, this entire passage, is all about the brethren. That's you, that's me, that's people who are identified with the body of Christ. People who identify themselves with the body of Christ, I should say. Okay? So this is talking about us. It's talking about brethren. And these are the words that are used about the brethren's conscience. Weak, defiled, and wounded. Always let your conscience be your guide. Even though it's weak and defiled and wounded, possibly. Okay, now I'm not, okay. Now, we're all familiar, I know I've used it several times, with 1 John 3:20. If our hearts condemn, or in other words, if our conscience accuses us, remember what our thoughts are doing, our competing thoughts, our alternating thoughts. They are alternately accusing and excusing. All right, so John says, if our conscience accuses us, if our hearts condemn, same thing. If our conscience accuses us, God is greater than our heart. So, okay, brethren, let me ask you now this. In the context of Romans 2:15 that we've just looked at, can we trust the accusings? Right now we're just talking about the accusings, remember? Can we trust the accusings of our possibly weak, defiled, wounded conscience? So when our conscience accuses us, can we trust that? Well, let's go on. This is the conscience that Paul says seems to be embroiled in conflicting competing, alternating thoughts, right? All right, let's take a look at this from another angle. In chapter 4 and verse 4 of 1 Corinthians, Paul says this. He says, "For I know nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord." And that word judges there means examines, and we'll talk about that more in a later lesson when we start talking about the other side of the conscience, okay? But anyway, but here's what he says. "For I know nothing against myself." In other words, what? I have no accusation against myself. Or we could say it this way, the thoughts of my conscience excuse me. Right? The thoughts of my conscience excuse me. And then he said, "And yet, I am not justified by this." I'm not justified by the excusings of my conscience, but he who examines me is the Lord. And then in another place, Paul says to Timothy, "There are those who have their own conscience seared as with a hot iron." In other words, there are those for whom justifying and excusing is the regular default of their conscience. Now, we've known some of those people. Probably we've been those kind of people. See, I was that kind of person when I was a verbally abusive man to my wife when it came to that particular aspect of my life. Justifying, my conscience justified and excused me all the time. See? All right. So in other words, justifying and excusing, is the regular default of their conscience. So, once again, brethren, in the context of Romans 2:15, can we trust the excusings of our own conscience? Can we? Apparently not. Apparently we cannot trust the accusings or the excusings. And so when he says in Romans 2:15, their conscience bearing witness, their conscience also bearing witness, and their conflicting, competing, alternating thoughts, accusing or excusing them, we are not to look at that and say, always let your conscience be your guide. If your conscience excuses you, woo, do what you please. If your conscience accuses you, see, live under that burden of shame and worthlessness, okay? All right, so apparently not. So I said, can we trust the accusings or the excusings? Apparently not. Neither the accusings or the excusings of our conscience are necessarily a reliable witness. Why? Because still today, in spite of a 2,000-year-old revealed gospel, our conscience is still predominantly the product of sin consciousness. Right? That's been the major message of the church for nearly 2,000 years. After the first few hundred years, right? Or also known as the knowledge of good and evil. So, see, our conscience is, according to Paul, it's weakened, it's defiled, it's wounded by what? By the arbitrary values, that are imposed upon us by the continued practice and preaching of dualism. When I think back over some of the messages that I preached in my early years, and when I think back over some of the messages that I heard that made any impression upon me at all when I was a young man, attending the Baptist church, the Presbyterian church, I realized that almost weekly I was being exposed to a strong diet of dualism. Okay? Every time I heard about my Adamic nature that cohabited with the Jesus nature inside me, that just depended on which side of the spiritual bed I got up on in the morning. How, right? Okay. But see, the knowledge of good and evil / sin consciousness subjects your every thought to conflicting, competing, alternating positions, so that once again, the quality that is called good or deemed good by this measurement is nothing more than an instrument of death. An instrument of separation, exclusion, violence, and retribution. And likewise, now listen to this though too. This is the good news on the other side of it. Okay? Likewise, the evil that has been defined by this standard also must become suspect, right? When we realize that it has been labeled by the good from their arbitrary, eye of the beholder, arrogant position in the seat of Moses. I need to say that one again because you got to get this. The evil that has been set before us, the evil that has been classified for us through sin consciousness, through the knowledge of good and evil, that evil that is part of the dead works, the other half of the good that is part of the dead works from which the blood of Christ is to cleanse our conscience. That evil, though, as the good must become suspect, so the evil becomes suspect all of a sudden. Is it evil? Well, I don't know, you see. And it becomes suspect when we realize that it has been classified evil for us by the good, making an arbitrary, eye of the beholder evaluation from their arrogant, it can be my arrogant too, I'm using them to get the blame off me right now, okay? From their arrogant, position on the seat of Moses, as Jesus called it, all right? You say, well, Mike, I know evil when I see it. Well, let me ask you this. Do you? Where did you learn and who taught you? I want you to think about this a little bit. Now, I know that we can certainly, I will say certainly, we can nail down a few from the 10. That's 10 and only 10, say, which, for what it's worth, the 10 Commandments of God, for what it's worth, if you'll allow me, I don't see so much as God giving to inform them of wrong that they were unaware of. I see that God giving them the 10 in order to narrow the field, in order to bring back to some sense, that broad capacity of the knowledge of good and evil that was consuming them and killing everything. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it makes a lot of sense to me. As Caleb said in the class he was teaching, that when they began to write down the scriptures in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they actually began to record the scriptures, the idea before them was if 10 were good, 3,000 are better. Right? And that's what we do, isn't that right? Because that's the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil says, hey, if you got 10, then let's expand it out to 3,000. Wow. 3,000 good and evils. Because every good in dualism demands an antagonistic evil, right? Has to be one. You can't have a good without having an evil. Can't have an evil without having a good. That's what the knowledge, that's how it destroyed it. Think about how difficult that has been on us all down through history. I don't think we have the capacity to even imagine what we would look like were we not obsessed with the knowledge of good and evil, were we not submerged in sin consciousness. And for people to have the idea that Jesus came and died on the cross because of our behaviors is ridiculous. Jesus came and died on the cross to set us free from sin consciousness, to relieve us of this heavy burden of the knowledge of good and evil that we were never created or equipped to bear. And of course, yes, behaviors, result from these kind of things. But as I said, no more consciousness of sins is not something you will ever be able to engage individually until you realize that it is not a behavioral issue at all. It's the issue of regarding no man according to the flesh. That's the issue. Well, if that's the issue, if that was the statement, as it was when Paul made it, then we have to understand that that was the heart of God and is the heart of God and will always remain the heart of God to regard no man according to the flesh. Right? So his regard for humanity, his concern with humanity, is the way we are cutting our own throat, breaking our own bones, destroying our lives, ministering death one to another through this knowledge of sin and death. Through this knowledge of good and evil, a.k.a. sin consciousness. Consciousness. Oh, the evangelicals go mad when you say it's about sin consciousness. No, it's about the things you do. Well, the things you do are so totally regulated, or don't do, are so totally regulated by the law, by the knowledge of good and evil, right? See? Okay. Anyway, let's bring some closure to the question of Jiminy Cricket's message. Always let your conscience be your guide, right? I hope that you can I just did a brief thing today, but I hope you can see that this message that was given by the angel stands at odds with the gospel. Paul did not tell us to always let our conscience be our guide. In fact, he let us know that we were most likely, them for sure, and he couldn't imagine that we would still be in this bad a shape later on, but that our conscience was weak, defiled, and wounded as we continue on in the dualism of the knowledge of good and evil, as we continue on as the self-appointed administrators of good and evil, as we continue on imagining arrogantly ourselves to have the mind of God and to be qualified to designate yea, nay, good, evil, sacred, secular, physical, spiritual. See what it did to us? It destroyed our ability to think. So we have conflicting, competing, alternating thoughts. So anyway, so we see that Jiminy was set up. It was a setup. It was a messenger of Satan disguised as an angel of light in blonde hair and a beautiful blue dress. Oh, I meant to say this too. In that, when she anointed him, I'm going to call it anointed him, she said, I dub you the Lord High Keeper of right and wrong. That's how she anointed Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio. The Lord High Keeper of right and wrong. Good and evil. I anoint you the master of sin consciousness. That's really what it said, if you think about it. Okay. All right, so anyway, here's the thing. The nature of our conscience, apart from the revelation of no more consciousness of sins, Paul is telling us, is weak, defiled, wounded, producing accusation and excuse that is conflicting, competing, and alternating. Now think about this. Have any of your convictions changed over the course of your life? Pro-Christian, as a Christian, within the Christian, have any of your, in other words, have there been any things that you, when you were young maybe, thought were good and you've now determined that they're evil? Or that there were things that you thought were evil that you've now determined were good? See what I'm saying? I mean, I remember when I first attended the Baptist church for a little while down in Arvada when I was in high school. I went because my girlfriend's father insisted he was the pastor and I had to go if I wanted to date her. Couldn't take her to go see Blue Hawaii if I didn't come to his church, right? Anyway, but, to that man, and he was a good man, and he loved the Lord, and he loved the people of his church, but if I had even had a sip of wine, that would have been evil. Of course, it would have been wrong then because I was 16, but I mean, for anybody to have a sip of wine would have been evil. Well, I don't mind telling you, I drink a glass of wine every night, sometimes 2 glasses. Things get bad enough, I might drink 3. No, not really. Not really. But I mean, you see, there was a time when I was convinced that any alcohol was evil. And now it's not that I'm, praising it, all of that, but now my convictions have changed about some things. That's what I want you to see. Conflicting thoughts, competing thoughts, alternating thoughts. There have been some things that have changed in all of your lives. Some things that you thought were bad that you now realize are not bad. Some things that you thought were good that you now realize are not good, right? That's humanity described for you, right? All right, now let's go back and wrap up in Romans 2:17. We're going to go back, or 2:15. We'll go back there and read it out of the New King James now. Okay, so now it says, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and then I will put this back in, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. We've all heard the term between a rock and a hard place, and that's kind of what this is talking about here, okay? It says between themselves. Now, between themselves, their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. So between themselves, first of all, speaks to our thoughts vacillating between good and evil, all right? And then consequently, our inability to settle in agreement among ourselves, right? When our conscience is guided by the dualism of the knowledge of good and evil, or sin consciousness. We're unable to settle in good. We're unable to settle. Let me say it this way. Where did liberal, moderate, and conservative come from? And I'm speaking among Christians right now, not among politicians, because these are words we use in the Christian community. So think about it, because it says here, between themselves, their thoughts, accusing or else excusing. Well, you can read the political posts right now and see the between themselves, their thoughts, accusing and excusing, right? But where did liberal, moderate, and conservative come from in definition of the Christian? Because I hear it all the time. Well, that's a liberal church. That's a conservative church. These are moderate Christians. These are liberal Christians. I hear those kind of terms. And there has to be a reason for those, because a Christian is a Christian. A real Christian is, okay? So where do we get that? Well, it's our inability, see? They have derived, these three, probably some others we could put in there, from the ongoing message of sin consciousness that's promoted daily, even among the grace-labeled preachers, right? Every time the message is a message from the base of the knowledge of good and evil or sin consciousness, there is something built into you that you cannot escape. As you sit there with the usual Christian amen response to everything that comes across this beautiful pulpit here, because it's got to be truth. As you sit there, you see, then what happens is this thing happens inside of you. This dualism demands of you that you categorize and classify good and evil. That's why we can sit in the same group of people. We can sit here together for weeks, for months, for years together, and then suddenly people are offended, or not offended, but whatever, you see. It's because, you see, there are conflicting thoughts. There are competing thoughts. There are alternating thoughts taking place based on everything that is said by anybody, right? I bear witness to this in the things that, and I don't want anybody to quit saying things to me, but in the things that people come up and say to me that they heard me say that I didn't say. Well, that's not bad. Sometimes it's good. I get a lot of enlightenment from it. Darlene does it more than anybody. She's always coming up here and telling me something I didn't think I said. But it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying you need to realize we need to see these things that go on in our life and realize that Paul was speaking to this, and you just cannot always let your conscience be your guide. I wish he'd quit singing that. Good Lord, that man's, okay. But anyway, see, when we begin to see that the knowledge of good and evil is indeed synonymous with sin consciousness, that sin consciousness is just the New Testament language for the Old Testament problem, as it was expressed in Genesis 2, all right? And then when we begin to realize that sin consciousness then remains that instrument of death that God spoke to them about when he said, in the day that you partake of, you will surely die. And in the moment-by-moment life that we live, as we partake of sin consciousness, we are destroying ourselves, our husbands, our wives, our children, our jobs, our communities, whatever. We are ministering a fatal blow or a harmful blow, a destructive blow in that moment that we partake of. Well, I'm sorry, that's what we do almost nonstop. That's why we have got to be able to understand this no more consciousness of sins. See, because then we'll be able to understand that no more consciousness of sins was and is in fact the central issue of the gospel message. It's that reason for which Christ came. At the day that you partake of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die. Where did death come from? Sin consciousness. But I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. Where does that life come from? From no more consciousness of sins. From having our thoughts, our hearts cleansed from an evil conscience. from having, our conscience cleansed of dead works to serve the living God. You hear what I'm saying? Okay, so in conclusion, we're not going to brand Jiminy as the Satan, okay? But rather we're going to recognize him as an evangelical fundamentalist. We're going to continue to love him as a brother. And because we're such good Christians, we're going to continue faithfully to pray for Pinocchio as he remains under the influence of this weak, defiled, wounded cricket who just can't help but give conflicting, competing, alternating thoughts. Anything out of that? All right. Be blessed.